at like age 9 as a bodybuilder, and now I'm going to circulate it really widely. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning, and thanks to Rafaela. I now feel especially old, but hopefully we'll have some wisdom to pass on from this incredible panel, so you now know who these folks are. And we've been doing these panels at Doc NYC for a long time, and this year we wanted to do something on development because we see it becoming increasingly important in the doc ecosystem, and it's the biggest part of it's the most underfunded part of the documentary world, but I think actually increasingly important, not just for filmmakers for whom it has always been important, but for a lot of the major companies who want to buy and distribute documentary work. And I want to start with Lisa Chanoff, because Lisa was the first, Lisa's organization, Catapult, was really the first to be a fund devoted exclusively to development. And I wonder if you could just say how you define development and talk about why it was important to you to support it.
So so the filmmaker Bonnie Cohen and I started Catapult about 8 years ago, and the way we define development is directly related to the purpose behind this fund, which is to deal with that conundrum of where you need to show a sample in order to raise money, but you need money to create the sample. So that's kind of at the heart of what prompted us to get started with Catapult. And so the way we define development is it's a little bit broad. It can be anything from you have you're at the right stage for us, anytime from you have your idea, you have access to your characters, you have an idea of the story you want to tell, and you haven't shot anything at all, and you need to get some initial footage and edit something. Or it's also, you might have been following a story for a year, and you have footage, but you've been using your own funds, or you've somehow been collected that footage, and you still haven't had a chance to really start doing your major fundraising or create a sample that you think represents what you have in mind for the film. So that's how we really look at development, is to have the materials you need to then really launch your fundraising.
And when you started it, what was the landscape like for development? Was there anyone else out there doing it? Like, why was that the area that you chose?
Well, so for the very reason that there was some. At that time, Chicken Egg used to have a We Believe in You grant, which at that time, which was, one of the inspirations for what we were doing, and of course Sundance has development, but development can mean something different for every group, every funder. So sometimes it's could be earlier or later. It can mean a lot of different things, but there really wasn't that much at all, and for that, so we really wanted to come in. Our interest was to come in and fill this need, and then also we love that stage. That we really think it's an exciting place to be, sort of early on in the process of a film. So it was exciting place to be. We really relished that early stage, but also really wanted to fill what seemed to be a real need.
Assia, as a filmmaker and as a first-time filmmaker, how did you get the earliest money to begin the feeling of being watched?
Yeah, it was a challenge. I mean, it's a 5-year-long process to make the film, and we were trying really hard to get development money the first 2 years, working really on those grants. The first money we got for the film were 2 artist services grants. It was Chicken and Egg Pictures. It was an accelerator lab and a grant, and then Firelight Media, also a lab and a grant, and then Catapult actually was our big development funding that we got in. And it was the moment we approached Catapult. I mean, it's one thing to have some material shot to describe the film, and there was a certain point about 2 years into the journey where I pivoted and it became a personal film. And all the footage we had, all the material that we were showing was from another kind of film. So we would show that material at pitches and then be like, well, it's not exactly that. I will be in it for this portion, and this is how it's going to be personal. And so we would describe with words what we wanted, what we would have been ideal to just show. At that moment, we didn't have the funding to reshoot a fundraising video or a teaser with the style that we had, intended to start shooting. And so that's where Catapult came in, and that was really pivotal. It allowed us to shoot a new teaser that was with this personal film style and the style that the film eventually took, that was a lot more representative of the film we were making. And so that was really important. I think most documentary films, you think you're going to make something, it shifts while you're making it. Organically, the process changes, and this development grant really allowed us to be flexible and pivot in the way that we wanted to pivot and have something to show for it. So, and also they were the most challenging, grants to get. But I would say once we got this development grant, it was in a lot of ways a trigger for a lot of other funding. So I think also
For us, for one thing.
yeah, for you guys for one thing. So Impact Partners came on very soon after Catapult. And I would say also before we got the investment, we also got a development grant. We got the Schwartz grant from Impact Partners, and that was really pivotal. There was a moment where we were suing the FBI, and we had thousands of documents to go through to help make our legal case, and nobody to help me do that. And that was a really key moment. So development money can also come at a moment where things are changing in your story, and you really need to be on top of that. So that, I think the key for development was being able to have the funding to really show what our vision was going to be and have a proof of concept for that. That was super important. And the other thing it did was trigger other funding. So it's a stamp of approval in a lot of ways, that first development money that you get that helps you get other grants.
And one thing that I noticed thinking about it is that the first grants that you got were chicken and egg, so motivated by wanting to support women filmmakers, and Firelight motivated by wanting to support diverse filmmakers. So it's also coming out of a support system for filmmakers regardless of what the topic of the film is. And it's something to think about for all of you who are looking for early funding is, what do you have that's special that speaks to the things that funders want to support, and how can you frame your project in such a way that you can get access to some of that early funding? Dan, yes. Neon is a crucial distributor in the documentary space. This year, you had Three Identical Strangers. 2019, you're going to have Biggest Little Farm, and you have been doing a tiny bit of development. I wonder if you could talk about what development means within the context of a larger distributor who doesn't really produce movies.
Sure. Well, I'll just preface all this by saying that in my wisdom, I took some Advil, cold, and sinus this morning, so I'm not exactly 100%. But so Neon is next month will be 2 years old, and in that time, the documentaries that we have done have been acquisitions, films that we bought, on the festival circuit. We've gotten involved with one documentary at sort of I think they were about midway through production, but we were able to see a lot of, what the film was going to be from the footage that they had, and that was a pre-buy. The challenge, I suppose, of development, being a theatrical distributor and all rights distributor in North America, is that the business model is not sort of set up to fund productions, right, all the way through. It's not set up to sort of outlay a bunch of cash for the production of a film that may take, as long as it needs to take, a year or two or three to come back. The way that the company was sort of set up and the way it's financed is to buy films and to release them, and to be able to sort of look at our calendar year and say, we're going to release this then, we're going to spend X, it's going to come back through these various means, and then we'll be able to sort of think in terms of, we'll have visibility into the kind of spending that we're going to do throughout, you know, a year or 2 year period. With production, it's, as you all know, different. It's the money goes out, and especially if you've got something special, you have to stay with it, and as long as it takes. And sometimes budgets can increase throughout their production. The other challenging thing is that being a distributor that buys these films ultimately and releases them, I think there's an expectation that if we're going to fund the development of something, if we were going to do that, and we've just started doing it a little bit, is that, well, if you're going to fund the development of it, why aren't you funding the entire production right now? You know, that would not be a question that I think that Impact would get, or that as much, or that Catapult would get, because they're in the business of saying, you know, we fund at a certain level, we look for partners to fund with. Now that Impact is in the development business, they can sort of put that out there and say, you know, this is a kind of financing that we're going to do. For Neon to fund the development of something immediately raises the question of, do you not have faith that this is ultimately going to be a film that you're going to want to buy later on? Which, you know, puts you a bit of a disadvantage in finding partners to fund the production. There's also, you know, when we have success on an I, Tonya or a Three Identical Strangers, there's a, I think, perception that, well, you have all this money, why are you not, if you really believe in this, why aren't you funding it? And if I fund it, I'm ultimately just going to want to sell it back to you. So that's tricky. I would just say that, you know, my background is as a producer, and so I'm always interested in us doing more production, getting involved at an earlier stage, being involved more with the making of these films. And in the case of this project that we did recently, we developed, it just happened to be an original idea of mine, which put us in a sort of a weird spot, because I had this idea for a movie. I found a director who was interested in making the film with us, and I found another company who was interested in co-funding the movie with us. But we needed some money in order to sort of demonstrate to, not only to ourselves, but to other potential partners, whether or not this was something that, you know, what kind of movie this was going to be. Is this going to be a feature film? Is this going to be a series? Is this just like a great short? It was not something, and that's what I think we're all trying to figure out, is sometimes you have a great subject, somebody you want to follow, somebody who's intriguing, you have an idea, but like, is it enough to sustain a 90-minute film? Is it too much for a 90-minute film? And so development on this project we did recently was really about figuring that out. But it was a challenge, because the way that distributors think is, what rights are we acquiring, right? And because that's our business. And for a distributor to fund the development of something, naturally sort of raises the question, are we really going to put money into this thing without acquiring its distribution rights? Are we going to have a first right of refusal to acquire the distribution rights later on, which seems fair until you get to the point where you're actually trying to get somebody to finance it with you, or finance it outright, and then they're going, yeah, but do you have is this yours? And you go, well, it's not ours in the sense that we haven't acquired the distribution rights. And then the question becomes, well, why not? You know, because we want to see it get made and then ultimately buy it later on. So that makes my job a little harder as somebody who's really interested in us doing more of this.
I'd like to take a minute and watch a clip that we have of the feeling of being watched, and then talk a little bit more specifically about what you had that helped unlock funding at different stages, to give folks a sense of, you know, what do they need to create to get some of this funding. So if we can roll the feeling of being watched clip, please. Our investigation ever pre 9/11, and never turned up a single crime. And it's an amazing film, and I wonder if you could talk us through what Catapult, saw, and what Chicken and Egg saw, and then what we saw at Impact, and how that changed, and how the development funding helped change that.
So it really, the arc of the whole project was following my investigation. So I started the investigation by going door to door in my neighborhood, asking people about their own experiences with surveillance, and that was the very first thing we filmed. On a 5D, really just ourselves, going, asking people about their experiences. And so, the trajectory of the film was also, I start investigating the FBI and filing Freedom of Information Act requests and starting to interview and meet with FBI agents. And that took a lot more resources. So we started with the community first and then got to the intensity of the investigation on the other side. And that took more resources. So the first things that we had was what we had filmed in the community. Some of this, what you saw in the teaser, was some of the first stuff, actually, that Lisa saw. And I think development funding, you're asking for it at a really, really early stage in your conception of your vision for the film. You're in like the first quarter, maybe. And you think you know what it is, but you're not super sure where it's going, especially with what I was working on. I didn't know how the investigation would pan out, and I had a few leads that I was following, and we knew that whichever lead would pan out would be the one that we would follow in the film. And so we had multiple threads going.
And how much, just a small tangent, how much film work had you done prior to this? Because this was your first feature. You had been a journalist, you'd been to journalism school, but to what extent was it also new for you just to be making a film?
It was very new. I was a public radio journalist before this. I worked on a couple of HBO documentary films as a researcher and an associate producer. Those were the first films I worked on. And I had the story in the back of my head for a while, and actually I always thought of it as a radio story. And I remember the director I was working with was, told me like, this is a story about surveillance, about ways of seeing. It should be done with cinema. It shouldn't be a radio story. And I said, okay, well, I guess I have to make a movie, and started making it. So yeah, you're learning a lot in the process. I never shot anything myself. We always had just enough to hire a cinematographer. But it was, a learning process. And on the one hand, you have the entire production of, the film and raising the funding for the film. And then on the other hand, you have the other rabbit hole that you're in, which is the actual investigation of the subject matter. So you're like thick in that and also thick in trying to make the film itself happen and get funded. So the very earliest stages of this process was, interviewing folks that I already knew, people in our community, and putting that on camera just to say, here's an experience that is collective, that is shared by so many people in the place that I'm from, and nobody really has an answer as to why any of this is happening. So it was like posing the problem in the footage that we had filmed. And the question everybody had afterwards was like, well, what's next? What's next? And will you interview the FBI? Will they give you access? How will you tell that, the bigger story? And we still weren't sure. We were still, we filed a bunch of Freedom of Information Acts, and let's see what comes back. And that eventually took years to pan out. But so it started out really small, just in the community. And I think a lot of it had development funding. A lot of it is not so much about what you show, but I think funders are investing in you and your vision without having any proof of concept yet, pretty much. And so I think a lot of it has to do with building relationships. And over time, we had applied for it, but me and Lisa, basically I pitched to her at multiple different pitches. The first time was at Sheffield, at the meat market, and we had encountered each other multiple times at these different pitches and had a conversation each time about it. And I think over these conversations, I was able to articulate the vision, the greater vision for the film, and also say that, we're not really sure the things that we didn't have answers to, be really clear and transparent about, what questions are still there and what we don't know.
So Lisa, in your case, if you remember, can you talk about what convinced you that you had met at Assia a number of times, there had been a series of conversations. When was the moment when you thought, okay, yes, this is something that we want to support? Do you remember what got you there?
Well, I can say that you know every film has its own trajectory and own special journey, and this one, of course, there was some footage, right, that you had, and so and not every project does that we see or that we support, but there was some. But since it was a personal story, you know, you had access. It was easy-ish for you to collect the stuff. And so that was one thing, was that, you know, there was something very intimate in the footage, even if it was, you know, you could just say, okay, this is the way that people are talking. I mean, it was in obvious why. I mean, this was your family, this was your community, but you could say, oh, everybody's very comfortable. It was very intimate, and that was always something, or often something that you can really want to see early on if there is some footage. It's like it's very special access. So that was something that was clear. And then you know, very often the filmmakers, you don't know a lot of the answers, and we are saying, well, tell us about your film, although we know you don't know what it is yet, because it's, you know, and so we don't really expect that everybody knows exactly. And a lot of times, especially when we're having these conversations, it's not so much, you know, I have these answers, but this is the way I'm thinking about it, and that can be really, really compelling. Like, yeah, well, I know this could be a problem. I know this is something we have to figure out. This is some of the ways we're thinking about it. This is our plan B, all that kind of stuff. So that can be very, very, you know, really make a difference. So I think those were those calls. And then, you know, there's always, I mean, this was your first film, and we don't generally, first-time filmmakers is not generally our sort of the profile, because we like to see prior work, but you know, there's always the question, well, like, you know, why tell this story? Why tell it now? And why are you the one to tell it? And the answer for all three of those were pretty clear. So it was a combination of things.
I was just going to say, you know, this film, The Feeling of Being Watched, I like this film a lot, and it's easy now for me to sort of, having seen the film and heard you answer questions, think about what I would have wanted to have seen in a pitch for development, because I know exactly what I like about the film, and I know exactly what it is that the elements that I would want that would get my attention, right? And you know, the core of the story, the characters, your family, you, and your decision to make the film, and where you came from professionally, and how you made that move. The thematic sort of sophistication of it, the panopticon stuff, like that really deepened it for me. And then the stuff that is, you know, the kinds of stuff you would imagine seeing in a trailer, like the visit from the FBI agent, and that weird phone call you got, and or that call you had. And yet I know now that I know all of this, but you may not have had all that. And so the decisions that these guys had to make were based on, it was a big leap of faith and a lot of that had to, I imagine, come from you saying, like, this is how I see this movie, but you couldn't prove it yet. You had to go out and make it. So it's easy as a distributor to sort of look back and go, oh yeah, I would have done that, but I don't know that I would have.
It's a great point, and I'm thinking about, like, at Impact, what we saw and when did we decide to get involved. And I think, so we saw some early material, a little bit more than what was up there, but a lot of that material. And I think what struck me, and Jenny Raskin, who's here, who runs our filmmaker relations, was what struck us was, on the one hand, this is a story that is huge. It's a giant investigation, and yet nobody's ever heard of it. It's also super specific. It's happening in this one particular community, and it's a Muslim community outside of Chicago, and that has enormous political ramifications, and it's interesting in the world right now. And then we look at Assia and we think, you know, here's someone who is on her way up, so she doesn't have all of the answers yet, but she's super smart. This is her family. This is herself. She's going to put everything she has into this for her own emotional reasons and to launch her career. And, like, you combine all these things and you feel like, okay, here's a filmmaker who has their shit together, who's going to put everything into making this film. This is a film that speaks to this cultural moment. Like, this is something to bet on. And so, but it was seeing it that enabled us to do that. I don't think we would have been able to put, hundreds of thousands of dollars into the movie without having seen something. It was like that was a bridge we could get over, and then we could think about all the other deeper issues.
And actually, it was at that stage when we pitched to Impact Partners. We had been filing Freedom of Information Acts with the FBI for a year and a half, and for a year and a half, almost 2 years, I was getting letters back saying, we can neither confirm nor deny that these records exist. We lost them, unforeseen circumstances, like crazy letters. Each time I filed something, I would get another, stop. And then one day I got a letter saying, we have 33,000 pages of documents that we've uncovered about this investigation. But we can't give them to you right now. So it was that letter that said we had 33,000, and that was actually the basis of my pitch to you guys.
And that also, that's right, and that letter helped us feel like, okay, there's a plot. Like, now we know where the story is going. We don't know where it's going to go, but it's going somewhere.
Yeah, and that was always the biggest challenge. I mean, what you were saying, Dan, was exactly the responses I was getting at a lot of my pitches. Well, it sounds like a great idea, but where is it actually going to go? And I don't have an answer because I'm in the middle of an investigation and I'm trying to see something pan out, and I'm not sure whether I'll actually get any answers at all. And so that was a moment where we said, oh, okay, this thread is the one that's going to pan out. We didn't know that we would end up in court suing the FBI. We didn't know any of that, but we knew there are these 33,000 pages, and that's something,
And Lisa, how do you think about that in terms of making such an early investment in something? Some of them are not going to work. How do you kind of balance that out in your own head? This feeling of we're going to give money, and sometimes it's not going to come to anything because the thing isn't going to develop the way we want. And how do you make your peace with that as someone who funds development?
Yeah, well, we recently went back and looked at all the grants we gave and how many didn't work out in that the film just did not get made. And it's really just a handful out of, 140 or something grants at this point. So now many of them turned out very differently, or took all sorts of turns, or, but in terms of ones that just didn't happen, it's not that many. So we feel like that's fine, that's pretty good. And some of them take quite a while. Like, some of them, there's one, we started giving grants, I guess, in 2011 was when we gave our first grants. And some of those films are just now, not a couple of them are just now. So it can be a bumpy journey sometimes, but yeah, it's been pretty good.
I'd like to open up to questions. I think the more time we can give to questions you guys specifically have, maybe answer them in a way that applies to a lot of people would be great. So do we know where the mic
There's
for
one over there.
questions is? Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, someone is sneaking his way over there.
Hi, thank you all so much. It's so helpful to hear this. I was wondering, in terms of the development stage where you're first researching an idea and you have a topic that you're interested in exploring and you feel like there's compelling stories there and there may be compelling characters there, but you need to do the casting work, you need to do travel, you need to do reporting. Are there resources that are available for that stage, before you're ready to take a camera out in the field and start putting together, some kind of sizzle or some kind of fundraising reel?
It's a great question. Lisa, what would you say if that project came to you? Would you guys consider it?
Yeah, no, I think that's the next frontier, is that stage, because like for Catapult, we will come in quite early, but we do want to have, know who the characters are, and that you have access to the characters, and that you not only have sort of a subject, but that you have a story. So that can be a tough stage, especially when there's travel involved, for sure. sure.
So for Impact Partners, we just announced yesterday a development fund of more than $1 million that will be deploying in 4 to 8 films a year with grants at a minimum of $10,000 and a maximum of $100,000. And that's going to start on December 1st. We're going to start accepting applications to that. And this is something that we have been thinking about of, how early is development? And I think one of the reasons we created such a range of possible grants is that we do want to be able to support anything that's early that we love. And so I think one of the tricks in the phase that you're talking about is the question of what do you bring to it as a storyteller yourself? Like, it's one thing if it's very, very early, but you've made 1 or 2 films before and they've been really good and they demonstrate a certain storytelling quality and style and approach, so that we can then imagine, okay, well, if something pans out here, we kind of have a sense of the kind of thing that we could be able to create. And it would also speak to your instincts as a storyteller. Like, if you've made these really good films and now you think you see something powerful here, then that gives further credence to it. I think as a first-time filmmaker, it's very, very hard because there's no history that demonstrates what you can do, and the process is so speculative. So in a situation like that, if you're there, I would say partner up with someone who's done it before. Find a producer whose work you love who might be interested in this. Like, find someone else who can lend credibility that can help make a more attractive package to a funder.
I'm also potentially a first-time filmmaker. I have a story up here, very clear story, although we'll see how it goes. Characters, great access. And I'm going to buy a camera, and I'm going to go just start, developing, my thing. And I guess my question is, I'm listening to this, I think, wow, if I did, have some development funding, I could hire, a cinematographer, and, I definitely, I'm very good at spending money. I know in post and key art, and I've been, here all week, I know all the things you can spend money on. My question, which I will finally get to, is, for someone like me who's probably just going to do it all myself, right? Just because it's a learning experience. What am I missing by not working with developing funding? I mean, putting aside the question of whether I could even get it, to that last question. I guess I'm just wondering, like, as I'm listening, I'm like, but I think I can just do this, and then kind of, it's going to be rough, but it's going to be done. So.
Can I was just going to say it's hard in the beginning, but it's worth it because it will help you get other funding. And once you get the early development funding, and I would also say that the funders that give you development money are the most invested in your project. And a testament to Catapult, actually, we got finishing funds from Catapult at the very end for, we had like a hole with animation that we wanted to pay for. And they came in and filled that hole at the very end. So sometimes your supporters from development and the very early funders are like the most solid ones that believe in your vision the most and will help you at the end, and might come in with resources or legal or whatever it is that you might need at the end. Sometimes they'll be there for you there. So it's a relationship worth building.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
I just want to say one other thing. So sometimes, like, if you're a first-time film and let's say you're applying to Catapult, and you don't have prior work to show, it can be, and you have a little bit of footage. It's actually can be really to your advantage. Let's say with us, because we might, if that's, if you say, well, I don't really have a sample yet, but here's a little bit of footage of my character, and you can see how great my character is, or here's a little footage of the landscape, or whatever is really strong about the project. So that can be, you can make up for some of the other aspects of the sort of the overall profile by saying, oh, I have a little bit of footage. You can see, even if it's not something edited and
And to Assia's
all
point,
put
it's
together,
worth
you can kind of get a
developing.
glimpse of what I'm looking at.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi. Sorry for another first-time filmmaker question.
That's why we're here.
I just finished a short, like a 30-minute film, and I really want to keep expanding it further. I shot, edited, and filmed the first one myself, and I don't ever want to do that again. What can I do in expanding this short into probably a feature besides getting another more experienced producer to really help me getting more funding and more support in this kind of first-time filmmaking sphere. Thanks.
Can you be more specific about what the question is when you say, what can you do?
Like, what are you looking for in an application besides another team that can really like show that that this is something that can be expanded from a short to a feature?
I think the most important piece of it is your sense of what the story is. If you have a 30-minute short and you want to expand it into a feature-length film, what do you know about that story, about what's going to be happening to those characters over time that's going to be interesting for 90 minutes of film?
Okay.
And if you can say to us, here are these extraordinary characters, here's what happened, and now what's going to happen over the next year is X, and we want to follow that,
Got it.
that's the most important piece of it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say that sometimes we get applications for exactly that situation.
Right.
And for us, since we're so focused on the sample, one of our first questions is, well, why isn't your 30-minute film your proof of concept? So that's very specific. But also really the question of like, okay, you've made this perfect 30-minute film. Why should it be a 90-minute?
Right.
Why should it be longer? So that's one of the things that we often look to.
Right. Yeah,
So.
that was very helpful. Thanks so much.
Hi. There's been a lot of talk about sizzles and proofs of concept. I was wondering if you have that, what kind of complementary materials can set you up for a pitch? So like, how important is it to have a deck or a budget for sure, or what information specifically are you looking for? And then also related to that, what kind of like structure would you need to have set up to receive funding, say like a fiscal sponsorship, or how necessary is that?
Dan, as a producer, do you want to take that? Like, if you were developing something, what would you create?
Well, yeah, I would say that it's very important to have a sizzle, more important than to have a deck. A deck certainly complements a sizzle well, but a deck only, as well designed as it is and as cool as what's in there, like if it's a documentary and you haven't shot anything, or you haven't taken existing footage and cut it together in a way that suggests what the tone of the film is going to be and where what your artistic sort of direction is. What it always tells me on the buying side of things is, fair or not, it suggests to me a lack of motivation or urgency. If you haven't gone out and filmed the subject of your film and figured out a way to do that, which I know is hard, because having produced a bunch, it's like I've been on the other end of that. Where I say, I need some money to start making this movie, and I have gotten the question back many times, like, why haven't you just started making the movie? And for me, my answer to that had to be because I don't know how to operate a camera or edit video. But that's not good enough, because what I ought to be able to do as a producer is find someone who can do those things, convince them that this is a worthy thing worth pursuing. And if I haven't done that, it's because I want it to be easier. And I'm not motivated enough to go out and make the film. I'm just hoping that someone will give me money to start down that road. And that's not inspiring, a lot of people just practically can't afford to start making their film until they have a little bit of funding to support that work that they're doing. But a lot of other people figure out a way to do it, and that's what you're competing with. And so having the best footage that you can capture, edited in a really strong way, that signals as much of what it is that you're capable of as a filmmaker as you can at that point. And then complementing that is a deck. I think that, the mistake I always used to make as a producer was that I would write these 5-page things about what the movie was going to be, and no one would read them. The people focus on aesthetics, because that's a big part of what it is that you're doing as a director. And they want to see characters, they want to see pictures, and they want to have a sense of like, if I open this deck and it strikes me visually as being really interesting, that tells me something about the director. A lot more than like the 4th or 5th or 6th paragraph that I used to write. Budget-wise, I would suggest for us, this is not the case, I think, for you guys, but we don't expect to see a budget, at least in the initial pitch. If we were to ask you for a budget, that would be something you'd have to consult both a producer and a lawyer about, because when you send a budget to us, you're basically telling us how much the movie costs, and we can make a decision about what we're going to buy it for based on that budget. So you're sort of starting a negotiation when you send us a budget. That's a little tip. But for funders who are in the business of funding and not buying your movie, they need that information. They need to know how you're gonna do this and whether or not you've really given that a lot of thought. And I think that a director's statement sometimes helps when you've said, like, this is why I want to make this film. This is why I've always wanted to make films. This is the film I want to make, and this is why. I like reading that. Not everyone will read that stuff, though.
Lisa, it begs a question of what are the deliverables that are coming out of a development process? So we've talked about what you want to see when people are applying, but what do you think, when you give them the funding, what is the goal then? Like, what do you want them to create that they come out of the development process with that's then moved the project forward another step?
Right. So again, about the sample, I mean, that's what it is. That's the main deliverable, which is the sample, and it can be specific to the project. So, for example, if there's nothing shot yet, then it's, we want to do initial shooting and create, let's say, a 5-minute sample. So that would be deliverable. So it's really what the applicant has said they want to use the money for. It can also be, we need, we've got this piece, but we need to add crucial stuff because the story has changed, or we don't have this crucial character in yet, so we need to create something that has that. So that's what it would be. And the idea is that what we want to know is, okay, well, why, if you already have something, for example, why isn't that good enough to get you going and fun? So we want to know. So the idea is, this is what I need to really show people what I have in mind. And that's what so that's the idea, that it's going to really give a huge boost to the project for fundraising. So it's really very specific to the project, what they think they need for the next step.
Sorry, just wanted to follow up on part of my question, which was, do you guys look for fiscal sponsorship?
Yeah, I mean, in order to receive a grant from us, you need to have a fiscal sponsor, but you don't need to have that set up to apply. So you don't, and we don't, it's neutral to us whether you have that when you apply, so.
And for us, go ahead, Assia.
I wanted to add one more thing, actually, besides the sizzle reel and whatever paper you have. Arguably, one of the most important things to have ready to receive funding is a good producer. So your team, and actually this was a key thing for me at a certain point. I was making the film maybe for 2 years, or a year and a half, 2 years without a producer. And it was when I brought on an experienced producer, the brilliant Jessica Devaney. As a first-time filmmaker, that was what signaled to a lot of funders that this was, this was really going to happen, and we were going to finish the film, and the funds would be handled responsibly, and et cetera. So that was it's a really, really important thing that a lot of funders are looking to, especially if you're a first-timer or you haven't made very well-known films, is that you have like a solid producer on your team.
Crucial point, yeah.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Hi, good morning. My question is about whether you fund series or just feature films. Maybe Lisa and Dan?
Well, so we don't fund series currently, and we basically fund 30 minutes or longer.
And yes, we will be funding series. Part of the inspiration for Jenny and I for the development fund was that we had a filmmaker or a team that we had worked with whose work we really, really loved, and they came to us and they said, we have this insane access in this one particular world, and we think it's probably a series. We don't really know. Maybe it will just be a feature, but if we don't start shooting now, we'll lose it. And we had so much faith in them as storytellers. They had already made 2 films as directors, and they had worked on previous films before that, and we loved their work, and we thought the access was so special that even though we really had no idea what it was going to be other than that, we gave them a 6-figure investment to just go start, and 3 months later they came back, and we all decided it was a series, and we went out and pitched it, and we set it up, and it's now in production with the company that we pitched it to, so the distributor. So yeah, often you don't know at the beginning of the process if it's going to be a feature or a series, and we're open to both.
Thank you.
Hi guys, thanks for being here, and congrats on the Academy Award for your film. And that sort of has a lead into my question. How do you work around a film that's very sensitive with issues that deal with our government? Like I'm pitching my project, and the back end of it, it's about a quarter of the way done. I love what you had to say, Asha. Is that how you say it?
Assia.
Assia. We're about a quarter of the way in. I've been carving this film out. I'm also one of the subjects, but I'm producing it, and I'm doing the assembly myself. My editor's on the West Coast, ready to jump in when I have a script carved out. I have a great director ready to come on board who recommended me to apply to Impact Partners. And she's ready to come on board, but, having that funding in place, trying to get the proposals ready. I'm just, I want to pitch my project, but there's part of it that's very sensitive that I don't want to, put out in the Ethernet, or, if I pitch to you and the subject seems viable, would you take a meeting to see the rest of it, or to see the research that I have and I'm trying to develop into the film? Or, what does it take to get a good hook, just to get in the door to...
Well, we're totally open. We have an open submissions process. Although in the case that you're describing, I would say we don't look at things until there's a director attached.
Right.
For us, we're a very the filmmaking that we like to support is very director driven.
Right.
Even though Impact supports films that address social issues, equally important to us is that there's a storytelling vision behind it, and it's worth making as a film. Forget about the other issue around it.
Right.
And so if we got a project that didn't have a director attached, there wouldn't be much for us to do with it. The storytelling approach is as important to us as anything else. So I'd also say that in general, I don't know if it makes sense to pit as as someone who hasn't made a film before and as a subject of a film. I think you need a director and a producer attached, and without that, it doesn't signify a huge amount of confidence in the subject by other people. And so I would work on that.
Yeah, so I think I have a director and producer attached that's ready to come on board, but it's they're ready to come on board if funding is in place.
Well,
so I'm trying to get them to work.
Good enough.
Yeah,
honestly.
they have to be invested in it.
They have to be invested and willing to. No one's saying that they have to work and make a movie for free, but they have to be willing to go and take meetings and be part of a team and push to get the thing done. And if they're not willing to do that, they're being attached. If there's money, I don't think does a lot for you.
Okay, that sounds good. Just one quick question for Lisa. Where do you come in? Do you have to have a director and producer attached, or?
Yeah, there has to be a director attached. Often there will be just a director at that early stage, and I definitely echo what Assia was saying about having, if it's a first film, having a experienced producer is a huge benefit. But yeah, if there's not yet a director attached, then we're not. It's too early for us to take a look at. But but we do definitely look at applications that are really sensitive, and we have all sorts of encryption, and we receive information. That's not a problem in terms of that.
Right.
You can pitch it and talk about people, and people are able to receive the information. But
Right.
it's I think the director part.
And
is
currently,
more-
I'm directing and producing it, and I have that experience. But this is my first film.
Okay.
I have production experience, but I want to bring on the people that have the experience in having done films. So that's in place. But I look forward to talking to you more later. Thank
Okay.
you.
Happy birthday, Dan.
Thanks, Tracy.
I work with a lot of filmmakers, and one of the questions that constantly comes up for first-time filmmakers especially, is how to find a good producer. And so, Assia, I was hoping you could talk about how did you convince Jessica to get on board, and the rest of you, what advice would you give to filmmakers? Because that's something I don't ever have a really good answer, especially before there's money to pay someone.
Actually, I started out asking a lot of the funders because they would literally tell me at like pitches and meetings, like, you really need an experienced producer we want to fund this project, but we need an experienced producer. And I literally would ask, like, who do you recommend? Like, who would be signal to you to be, an experienced producer that would be good for this project? And I was collecting names from folks that I met with, a lot of funders, and then other filmmakers. So Chicken and Egg was really helpful in helping me find a producer. Jessica was working on another Chicken and Egg film, and I approached her. I also was really helpful. Actually, before I brought on a producer, I brought on an executive producer, Daniel Chalfin, who is amazing with Naked Edge, and he recommended Jessica as well. So it was like a lot of word of mouth, and a lot of the experienced producers are sometimes already attached to a project or have too many projects on their plate, so it's a challenge to find someone who's not on something already. But yeah, just asking around and seeing what people's loads are, like how much do they have on their plate, and taking meetings with people. But yeah, it was a great synchrony. Jessica had worked on a couple of other films, most recently Speed Sisters, which was all shot in Israel and Palestine, and she had a familiarity with some of that world. That was really helpful. So yeah, and then also another great thing we did, because it's really scary to bring on a producer. I was 2 years into the project, super, my hands in all of it, and doing almost all of it by myself, and it was scary to think about bringing on someone, and is the project going to be taken away from me, or is the creative direction going to change because of this new voice? It was like a very scary time, and something that we did, which was really lovely, actually. Jessica was like, let's date before we get married. And so we dated. We had like a 3-month period where, like, let's see how it goes. Let's see how the relationship works out. Let's see if this is, and it was also like, let's see if we can get funded, because it was on a contingency until we could get funded. And that was amazing. I would recommend most people, like, test before you sign a contract for a long-term relationship, test someone out, see what it looks like for a few months. And a lot of it is relationship, is like personalities too. It's like, can you get along in terms of personality? You're going to be spending a lot of time with this person. Do you trust them? Do you trust their vision? Do they trust your vision? So think of it as a relationship, and maybe not dive in all the way right away, and test it out first, and talk to a lot of people about this person too. Ask other filmmakers whose projects they've worked on, like, what was it like working with this person, etc. But yeah, like, vet people.
Hi, thank you guys so much for sharing your expertise. I'm wondering, again, as a first-time filmmaker, if you have really unusual access and a strong story, if submitting a teaser or a sizzle that's really strong, if your vision is one where you're taking some stylistic or structural kind of liberties, or you want to make something maybe perhaps more experimental, if that's too high risk as development funders, if you can demonstrate that will be strong in a sizzle, is it still something that you would be resistant to? And also, if there's a point at which you perhaps have too much shot for it to constitute development funding.
Yeah, on the first question about sort of taking some creative risks, I think is what you're asking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, we welcome that, because we're really interested in the story, and then the storytelling, and what's going to be really what's cinematic about your story, what's interesting about the storytelling, in addition into the story. And so, and especially if you have unique access, then that can be a great combination. Now, when often if the sort of creative art, sort of more artistic storytelling, without a sample of your prior work, that can be a little difficult because it's very, then it becomes a very, something that's great to have a visual sample of. So, if you're planning to catapult, like you say, you wouldn't need to have your sizzle or your sample already done. But, if you have, I guess if you have something very short and then you need to expand on it, that can be a benefit. I mean, there's other ways, too, that people can show their vision. I mean, especially if you're a first-time filmmaker, they don't get you all the way over, but they can help with the overall, like one project where it was her first film, but she had taken all sorts of photographs of the location, and she included the photographs, and so that gave us a sense of the place, which was quite important to the film, and also her eye, and so that helped. And there's other, sometimes if you don't have, for example, footage of you haven't shot something of your character, but there's somebody who might be, have something on the internet. I mean, I often will Google somebody just so I can see what they're like, so you can send, so you can get a little creative in what you send to give us a little bit of visual. But, and we do ask also, is there another filmmaker's work that you feel this is sort of, you're inspired by? And again, doesn't get you all the way over the finish line, but that is part of something that can kind of help. What was your second question? Oh, about too far along?
I mean, I have a ton of footage,
Yeah.
so I guess my question is, with a really strong representation, despite not having prior work on the level that I'm aspiring to make, if that suffices to sort of be willing to put the risk, move forward with something that perhaps has a different approach.
Yeah, that could be great. I mean, for us, for Catapult, if you have already a lot of footage, our question would be, well, how do you want to use the grant, and how is that, going to push forward your fundraising in this early stage? So you might have a lot of footage. That often is the case. The story's happening or whatever. But we would still want to know that you're like, if you're beyond the point of putting together a sample, for example, we would definitely say, well, don't apply for the grant. Don't tinker around with the sample just for the sake of the grant. So you might just be beyond. But we would still look to see, okay, is the use of the grant still in our window, our mission?
Thank you.
I would also just say to that it's important to sort of, even if your material and your approach suggests that you're going to make a film that is sort of experimental, really artistic, that you root your pitch in something in a tradition of other films, because nobody's doing anything entirely new, and to be able to say, I've seen these other filmmakers, I respect them, I want to do some of what they did, I want to do something original of my own, but I recognize that I'm not making something that is completely singular.
Right, of course, yeah.
That helps from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, I think that's true, and we love to see things that are unorthodox and different. I mean, that's what it's worth getting up in the morning when you get to see something great that's new that you've never seen before. And but at the same time, we've also, Jada and I have sat through so many pitches where we hear from a filmmaker, this is not a regular documentary. And whenever we hear that, we know like our minds are out the door, we're done. Because there is no such thing as a regular documentary. And what those people who say that mean is that they like watched documentaries as a kid in the 70s and 80s that were like historical on PBS, and they basically haven't watched documentaries since then. Yeah. And so, so if you want it, if central to your pitch is going to be that you're going to do something experimental, and you haven't made a film before, that's a heavy lift. Some people can do it, some can't. But B, you really need to demonstrate for us like that you know what experimental means.
Right.
That there's a frame of reference for you in nonfiction filmmaking that's been happening in the last 10 years that you understand, and that you're working in that kind of tradition.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. This has been very, very helpful. I was at the Access panel yesterday, which was really, really helpful. But listening to the importance that your fund, that Catapult puts on access as a condition of funding, it raised additional question in my mind with regards to, so I have a subject that I was working with directly on his story. He's passed away, and the family didn't really know or understand that we were working on this, how intensely we were working on this together. What kind of advice would you give? I mean, maybe that's an offline question because it's too specific, but what advice would you give to people doing a film on subject where the family members exist, but the subject may not exist anymore. I mean, the subject's passed away.
Yeah, and we can definitely chat in
Offline.
detail if you want, but yeah, I mean, things come up, and unexpected things come up in the course of making a film. So I would just imagine how much are the family members key to your story, and then you just need to reach out. But we can talk more.
And people having passed away doesn't mean that there isn't archival material. Even for someone who's not a public figure, there can be family movies, there can be letters, there can be photographs, there can be audio recordings. So someone being dead doesn't mean that there isn't a wealth of material about them, but sometimes it takes a lot of digging.
The ability to get access to the story with or without the family.
Right.
So if the
Yeah.
family's not necessarily interested or keen or cooperative.
Yeah, that's a tricky, very specific question. Yeah. Okay. So we're out of time, but thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks to my panelists, Assia, Lisa, and Dan.